Hi everyone, welcome to the April 6th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to be recapping last weekend's slew of stakes races from around the country. It was a final week of Kentucky Derby preps in Kentucky, California, and New York, and we were talking about it last week. We kind of needed some clarity on this Derby trail, and I think we got a little bit of that, even though some of the results shook up the picture quite a bit. We'll get to that in a little bit. We also had a quartet of Kentucky Oaks prep races at all of those venues, including one at Oaklawn Park in Arkansas, so that's really cleared up the Oaks picture quite a bit, and I think that's looking a little bit more optimistic than it was a week ago when it seemed like there was a real dearth of talent in that three-year-old filly division. We did see some nice performances on the Oaks Trail this past weekend. And then we'll just wrap up the action on the undercards of all of those races at New York, at Aqueduct, at Santa Anita in California, and at Keeneland. There were a bunch of stakes races on the opening week of their spring meet there. So we'll talk about all of it. A lot to get into on this podcast, so we'll dive right in. And Craig, the focus obviously is on those three Kentucky Derby preps, and we had a real range of performances and results in these races.
Yeah, we sure did. We saw a really solid race from Essential Quality. He continues to get, just run. All he does is win. He does it in a variety of ways, so no knocks on him. We saw a huge number from Rock Your World, and then we saw, I don't even know what to say about the Wood. I guess I'll wait till we tackle these races individually, but which one do you want to start with?
Yeah, let's go through them one by one. We'll start off with these Derby preps, then we'll get into the Oaks preps, and then we'll go track by track after that. So let's start with the Bluegrass, because I think that this race has solidified a likely favorite for the Kentucky Derby in Essential Quality, who is now 5 for 5 in his career. He's the defending 2-year-old champion. He's 2 for 2 as a 3-year-old, and he's really done everything the connections have asked of him up until this point. The one knock against Essential Quality is he hasn't really stepped forward and run that breakout speed figure that I think a lot of handicappers are looking for from him, but he does just keep winning, and he got the job done once again in this Bluegrass.
Yeah, he did it with a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. He's basically improved his speed figure every time. I'm actually looking at the PPs. I think he ran a 118 last time as well, but he did it carrying less weight. So the way I look at it in the PPs, he stepped up a couple points. He's done it from mid-pack. He's done it from the back of the pack. He's done it from near the front. So I've got no knocks on him. I'm not sure I'm going to want to bet him as a horse who's probably going to be the favorite. That could change given the Arkansas Derby, maybe slightly. But he's definitely going to be one of the top two choices, I would say. So I still have a few questions, but he's obviously a really good horse, and it's just going to come down to whether he's worth a wager or not for me.
Yeah, I'll say that, there's a lot to like about this horse. He's so consistent. He has an extremely versatile running style where it seems like Luis Saez has the option to put him right up on the pace or come from off it like he did in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. I don't think he's necessarily better using one style over the other. It just seems like he's able to produce top performances no matter where he's coming from, and they're able to make those decisions based on pace, which is what the connections really want in these horses. I will say he has gotten absolutely perfect trips in his 2 races this year. He got that perfect outside run over that dead rail at Oaklawn, so that was a good trip in the Southwest. And then in this race, there was no pace, and like I said, he's got that versatile style, so Luis Saez was able to put him right up on the lead. He was breathing down Highly Motivated's neck the entire way. I will say it took him a little bit longer to get past Highly Motivated than I was expecting, because It did seem like towards the end of that race, when Highly Motivated swapped over to his left lead, like he was really getting tired and wasn't quite getting the distance, and still Essential Quality had some trouble getting past him in the lane, and that does bring up the question for me about both of these horses getting the distance. I know most people just kind of take it for granted that Essential Quality is a 1.25 mile horse. I'm not so sure. He's by Tappet, but the dam side, his dam was a sprinter. So I am a little bit concerned about him getting the final furlong of the Derby, just based on the fact that he wasn't finishing the way that I would have liked to see him here, considering the slow pace. That said, he's been doing everything that's asked of him. So, he's definitely a contender moving on to Churchill Downs.
Yeah, and I think Highly Motivated ran pretty well also. It's just that there wasn't a lot of speed on paper, but it's not like they crawled where there were blue fractions. And of the two, I'd be a little concerned that I don't think Highly Motivated wants any parts of being on the lead. I do have distance questions, as you do as well, but I think he'd be a horse that'd be better served in a race with some pace where he could make a late run. I don't know that he's of the quality to beat essential quality, even though they both got 118 TimeformUS speed figures in here. Really no reason to think anything would turn the tables other than a bad trip, but I don't want to degrade his performance because I thought he took a very nice jump up and he gave the winner all he wanted, as you mentioned. As for the rest of the field, not a whole lot for me to get excited about. I mean, I guess Rombauer just ran okay. Hidden Stash just ran okay. He kind of proved that Tampa figure that Helium got, who's going to go straight to the Derby of 109, was basically a solid figure. All the runbacks from that have been good, so I'm not too excited about that prep. But yeah, it's just the top two for me.
Yeah, I guess they will go on to the Derby with highly motivated. I've seen Chad Brown say in the past that he's not even sure this horse wants to go a mile and a quarter. And I was kind of wondering coming out of this race if they'll consider turning back in a race like the Pat Day Mile for him. I know the allure of the Derby is tough to pass up for these connections, though Chad Brown's never a guy that's been solely focused on winning the Kentucky Derby. He'll get there if he has the horse. So I wonder what they'll do with him. They probably will end up in the Derby, but it will be interesting to see what path they decide to follow. Moving on to the Santa Anita Derby, which is the race that Craig mentioned at the top is the one achieving the highest speed figure that we saw in these 3-year-old preps this past weekend. And this was a breakout performance from the winner, Rock Your World, who had just run twice on the turf, and got to give a ton of credit to his trainer, John Sadler, not just for getting him to the winner's circle in this race, but for being right about his horse, because he was saying all along, even when this horse was winning his debut on the turf, going, I think, 6 furlongs, that this was a horse that he was looking for as a potential Kentucky Derby contender, because he really thought that he would handle the dirt and stretch out in distance, and he was right on both counts. They sent this horse to the front, and he just ran them off their feet.
Yeah, I mean, I think he becomes a serious contender for the Derby. He got a 124 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. There was nothing easy about his trip. He went fast early. He had a 148 opening quarter and half mile TimeformUS pace figure. So he was motoring, and from there he just pulled away from the field. He beat 2 pretty darn good horses in Medina Spirit and Dream Shake. They basically ran the same speed figures they've been running every time out, and he just dusted them like they were not there to warm them up. I would say Medina Spirit had a bit of a wide trip, but I don't think it was enough to make up the difference on what we saw from the winner. So I think that 124 is totally legit. It's the fastest TimeformUS speed figure that we're going to have in the past performances for the Kentucky Derby, given the injury to Life is Good. So serious contender for me. I don't think he has to go wire to wire. He's always been up close on turf, but he has rated a little off the pace, and that can be really dangerous in the Derby. So I liked what I saw from Rock Your World.
Yeah, I thought this was a strong performance by this horse. I mean, they sent him to the front and laid down some pretty quick fractions, but they were saying after the race that they don't feel like this is a horse that needs the lead. They just sent him so aggressively because they drew that inside post position and they wanted to secure that spot down towards the inside. I mean, the one thing that you might have to worry about with him rating in the Kentucky Derby if they decide to do that is that he will have to deal with kickback on the dirt for the first time, because rating on the turf is a little different than rating on the dirt. But that said, I was kind of looking through the points list of horses coming into the Derby, and it doesn't look like there's that much speed in the race, so I wouldn't be shocked if they use him aggressively in that race as well. And the only question for him, I guess, is the 10 furlongs, but based on the way that he finished here, I don't think that's going to be a real problem. And looking at the dam side pedigree, there were plenty of routers in there. I mean, they were mostly turf routers, which is one of the reasons that we were a little skeptical of him handling the dirt in the Santa Anita Derby, but he's definitely bred to relish 2 turns. He always has been. So this is a horse that I think has to be considered a serious player moving forward, and I wouldn't be too down on Medina Spirit coming out of this race. I was on the bandwagon coming in, and I'll still say that I'm on the bandwagon coming out. I mean, he just lost to a superior horse, but a lot can change in 4 weeks heading into the Kentucky Derby. Bob Baffert is obviously the master of getting horses to peak on those big days, and Medina Spirit, he does have the versatility of being able to stalk him these races. I've always thought that longer the better for this horse, that he would get the mile and a quarter distance, so we'll see what he does, but I wouldn't write him off yet.
Yeah, I'm not writing him off. I thought he ran just fine. He was a horse who definitely already had plenty of points to get in, so it's possible he wasn't even fully cranked, and maybe a race they'd be a little more aggressive would be the Kentucky Derby, and because I think they were a little bit passive in here, kind of ceding the lead and getting that wide trip. But yeah, just a really fast race. No surprise, it's from California. I am curious what they'll be with Dream Shake. I worry about him a little bit being so lightly raced, but he's obviously got a ton of talent. And then it was a big gap to everybody else, so I think it's just those three for me. But no big surprise. Santa Anita Derby, as usual, is a strong race and is going to provide some real runners to the Derby.
Yeah, ideally, I'd love to see a matchup between horses like Highly Motivated and Dream Shake in a one-turn race like the Pat Day Mile or something else like the Woody Stevens down the line, but I know that the Triple Crown races are tough to pass up for these connections. So we got some major Derby contenders coming out of the Bluegrass and the Santa Anita Derby. I'm not sure that we could say the same about the Wood Memorial. This was a race that just completely fell apart from a pace standpoint and from a contender standpoint, as there were a ton of disappointments in here. And Todd Pletcher, who looked like he might not have any Derby starters just a few weeks ago, now has potentially four of them, four that definitely have qualified based on points. And he had the top two finishers in this Wood Memorial as the 72-1 winner Bourbonic upset the field.
Yeah, this was a race. I mean, it was just ugly. It was slow. The pace is coded in red a little later in the race, but that's mostly a function of how it just fell apart, because really the fractions weren't any different than what we saw in the Gazelle a little bit earlier on the card for the fillies that we'll talk about later. But that race actually had a little bit more finish to it as far as time goes, so it didn't get the red coating. So I just don't know what to make of this race. You know, I brought up many times on this podcast how I just do not care for this Aqueduct surface. It's, as a speed figure guy, it makes it really tricky. It seems to change a lot. But that aside, forgetting the speed figure part, it just seems like horses have a really hard time getting over it many of the days of the meet. And I just don't know what they're thinking there, because I find it hard to believe that a lot of top connections are going to watch this Wood Memorial and think, yeah, that's a track I want to ship into if I have a serious Derby horse. So it just seems like, to me, they're kind of doing damage to their own races with this surface, and I think they need to do a better job. I can't remember. I don't think I mentioned the speed figure. It was a lowly 104 for Bourbonic. A couple of the horses in behind them got a little bit higher at 106, the runner-up Dynamic One and Wayburn, who led the race for a long way. But I just don't know what to make of this. They're horses who, if they were up near the front, normally I would look forward to betting them back when they ran on a more fair track, but I doubt those horses are going to go in the Derby, and they're probably not good enough because it wasn't a strong field to start with.
Yeah, we'll get into some of the Aqueduct speed figures later, because I'm sure it was a tough job for you this past week. There were a lot of changing circumstances on this track and some wacky times. And I mean, this Wood Memorial, though, I don't think was one of them. I mean, it just seemed like a slow race. And when you have long shots dominating, that usually speaks to the fact that a lot of the horses that were expected to do well just didn't really show up with their top efforts. And I think we saw a lot of horses just not getting the distance over a deep, demanding surface. Risk Taking, who was the favorite, he was a no-show. Prevalence, I mean, we were right about him, but we were right about him being just one of many no-shows in this race because he didn't really step forward either. I thought that Wayburn, who I liked in this spot, was getting a perfect trip coming to the top of the stretch and looked like he was going to finish it off, but he stopped, hit a wall like all the others did. I mean, I guess the one horse that you could say had a bit of an excuse was Crowded Trade, because he was off slowly and found himself a little bit farther back than they might have wanted him. But perhaps that worked out for him because he was coming on late at the end in a race that was falling apart. I just don't know what to say. I mean, as for the winner, Bourbonic, it's nice to see Kendrick Carmouche get a mount in the Kentucky Derby, and I would hope and I would imagine the connections will keep him on this horse since Calumet has had success with Kendrick. They gave him his first Grade 1 victory with True Timber in the Cigar Mile last year, and he's just a really likable rider in the sport, so it would be great to see him get a Kentucky Derby mount. And he gave this horse a perfect ride. He rode Bourbonic exactly the way that you're supposed to ride a hopeless-looking long shot, by just sticking him at the back of the pack and riding him like you want to get a piece, and hopefully the whole race will fall apart and you'll get more than a piece. And that's exactly what happened as he made the last move, and the last move was the best move. It's kind of crazy to me that this horse won, having watched him compete all winter. He broke his maiden in a maiden claiming race. Never looked like a horse that would be remotely competitive in stakes races, let alone a Kentucky Derby prep race. So I don't know what to make of it. But I'll be interested to see how these horses do on the first Saturday in May.
Yeah, I mean, he had just got dusted at Parks by Market Maven by 4 lengths, who was also in this field, went off 70-1 and did no running at all. So as far as the Derby goes, I can't take any of these horses seriously, and just hope for a better race next year for Aqueduct, because I love New York racing, and this race was downgraded recently, and a lot of people were up in arms about it. But if this keeps up, it could get even worse, because this is way below par for even a grade 2 3-year-old 100-point prep race.
Move on to those Kentucky Oaks preps, because I know Craig and I had been pretty down on this 3-year-old filly division when we were talking about it last week after that prep. The Gulfstream Park Oaks came back pretty slow, and I think we saw some glimmers of hope in the 3-year-old filly races this week. And we'll begin with the prep at Keeneland. That was the grade 1 Ashland, and this race might have given us our Kentucky Oaks favorite, though I think it'll be close, as Malathot kept her undefeated record intact for Todd Pletcher. She was originally supposed to run in that Gulfstream Park Oaks last week. They rerouted to this race at Keeneland, and she delivered a nice performance. Anytime that you got a horse that has a deficit to make up coming into that short stretch at Keeneland, you know they might be in trouble, but she put in a relentless stretch rally to get up past the Champagne, who took that 3-length lead into the stretch, and just a nice performance from the top two. But I think Malathot was a more impressive winner than the margin of victory might suggest.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree. And I'm one who bet the runner-up, which seemed to be a theme, me running second to Joel Rosario at Keeneland on Saturday. So I wasn't a big fan of his, but he just gave a lot of great rides. So no complaints there. I think Malathot was the best horse. She got a 106 TimeformUS speed figure, past the Champagne, who ran just fine, got a 105 as well, but just couldn't hold off that late charge. And of the two heading to the Oaks, it's hard not to like Malathot, because she looks like the one that's just going to gobble up any extra ground they throw at her. The pace was pretty moderate in here, and she was just absolutely flying home. Your buddy Courtney in New York wrote me asking about the late pace figure for Malathot. And while that's a combination of races, I actually calculated her late fraction in here, and I think it was in the 136, 137 range, something like that. So she was absolutely flying, and it was no fluke that she was able to get up despite things being stacked against her.
Yeah, I looked up the Trackist numbers for this race, and Malathot came home her final 16th in 5.93 seconds, which is just very fast for a dirt route, even with a moderate pace. She was really flying at the end of this race, and you could see it on the replay because, as I was saying, past the Champagne, horses that come into that short stretch with the kind of advantage that she had, they rarely lose at Keeneland, and Malathot was just able to run her down. And not only that, Malathot covered a lot more ground than past the Champagne did. She was wide around both turns. According to Trackist, Malathot covered 40 more feet than past the Champagne did, so there was just a lot to like about her performance. And on top of all that, she seems like a filly that's really going to relish the stretch out to 1 1/8 in the Kentucky Oaks, whereas maybe that's a question some others still have to answer. She seems like she's going to love it. So just nothing but positive things to say about Malathot moving ahead to that, I think you said the last Friday in April for the Kentucky Oaks. Let's talk about the Oaks prep that they ran at Aqueduct. That was the Grade 3 Gazelle, the race that took place right before the Wood Memorial. And you will note that the filly in this race, Search Results, who won, she did run a faster final time than the boys in the Wood Memorial. So clearly that translated to a higher speed figure. I will say Search Results is going to still have to get tested for class, because we mentioned it on the forecast last week. This Gazelle field was just not very good, and Search Results was an impressive winner and did it in hand, but she's going to have to face much better fillies when she moves on to the Oaks next time.
Yeah, she did get a nice figure. She got the best one of all the Oaks preps this week with a 110, and might actually be the best one we've seen this year around 2 turns. There was a quicker race at Keeneland around 1 turn that gave out some Oaks points, but solid enough effort. Again, it's a little tough for me to judge watching, because it still looked like she was struggling over that deep, tiring surface, but I'll say she did it a lot better than most of the other horses we saw this weekend. So I have no knocks against her. She does like to run up close. I'm not sure how much speed we're going to see in the Oaks, which could provide some problems, but despite having that best figure, it's hard for me to watch that race and say I love her in the Oaks. I much prefer Malathot despite running 4 points slower on our Timeform US speed figures, but I do think she'll be a contender and run fine. I like that she's able to stay up close to the pace. I just wonder if it'll get her in trouble if things get hot.
Yeah, I mean, we're both speed figure guys. I mean, you obviously make them. I'm a disciple of them. But these Oaks preps we're going to talk about, I would sort them a little bit differently in terms of a ranking than the figures have them. I agree that the Malathot performance to me was more impressive than Search Results, just because I know the horses that Search Results was beating. And while she did it in hand, and I don't think Irad ever took the stick out on her, she did it by 2 3/4 lengths and looked fine, but she still never changed leads in the stretch. And that's something that's could become a problem eventually when she faces tougher horses. In the Busher, she also hung on her left lead for the entire stretch drive. And here again, she never switched over to her right lead in the stretch. I mean, I think that she was winning easily enough, so she never really had to do it. And Irad didn't have to make her do it. But you want to see a horse be a little more professional with their lead changes when they're going to face the best 3-year-old fillies in the country in a few weeks. So I'm a fan of Search Results. I think that she's a nice horse, and she's got, as you said, that tactical speed that's always dangerous in these races. But still, I think she's going to have to face a real test when she moves on to the Oaks in 4 weeks. Moving on with these Oaks preps, we're going to go out to California where they ran the Grade 2 Santa Anita Oaks. Just a 4-horse field in this one, but I thought we saw some nice fillies, and Soothsay kept her undefeated record intact. She's just 2 for 2 in her career, but the fact that she was coming off a maiden win sprinting, that she was able to beat some more seasoned rivals in this 2-turn race, I think is a really good sign for her future prospects. And this was the slowest of the 4 Oaks preps that we're going to talk about, but I like Soothsay's performance. I mean, she had to make a premature move to the front on the backstretch, and she battled back pretty gamely when that Bob Baffert runner came to her in the stretch.
Yeah, I actually have this race up there almost as much as I like Malathot's. The speed figure was only a 101 for her, a 102 final time, but that was in large part because of the pace. I mean, it was just a dawdling pace up front. I like that she was able to sit at the back of the pack. She was a good 2.5 lengths back early, in last in this 4-horse field, and she was able to still swoop by everybody, and they were all still running at the end. So I thought this was a really good performance. We do have all the fractions coded in blue. We're going to talk about some races a little bit later where we use that P notation and upgrade the figure. It was a little tough to do in here because the other fillies just hadn't run that fast. I mean, it was kind of a borderline call, but I would say this race could have easily been 5 or 6 points faster without that slow pace. We're kind of telling you that with every single fraction being in blue that the pace inhibited the numbers. So I actually like Soothsay, and I hope she does show up in the Oaks because I think she's a major contender despite that lowish looking speed figure.
Yeah, I was wondering if you would consider doing that because the number, I agree, I think it was held down by how slow the early pace was. And I think Soothsay ran pretty well within the context of that race as she made that early move on the backstretch. And I mean, it looked coming to the top of the stretch like Beautiful Gift might issue a winning challenge, but Soothsay was pretty game to battle back. And I watched back her debut when she won going 6 furlongs, and she showed that same tenacity closing down the center of the track that she did, digging down on the inside here. So I think that this horse has a real will to win, and she strikes me as one that shouldn't really struggle stretching out in distance further. I mean, she's by Distorted Humor, but on the dam side, her dam was a graded stakes winning router. Her dam's a half to Kid Cruz, who wanted to go every bit of 9 furlongs. So I think there really is potential for this horse to move forward again in the Oaks if they decide to go there. I mean, she's so lightly raced, so others have that experience edge, but I think she does have plenty of natural talent.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fabulous ride that Flavian Pratt gave as well. I think he sensed that slow pace and he saw an opening on the rail. And one of the things that jumped out to me was the really quick turn of foot that Soothsay showed to take advantage of that hole and to, not be able to be closed down. And just a good ride. And that was just something that caught my eye, that she was able to move up there. It was a little bit tight and she willingly went through and then was just game all the way to the wire. But I just remember watching live how it just seemed like he caught the others napping, thinking they were just going to let him walk up front. And he made a bold move and a winning move.
We'll finish up the discussion of these Oaks preps with the final prep race down at Oaklawn, and that was the Grade 3 Fantasy, also going a mile and a 16th. And this is one that came up the second fastest Oaks prep of this past weekend on speed figures. I would probably rate it the weakest, though, despite that, because I just didn't think a whole lot of these fillies coming into the race, and Pauline's Pearl got the job done as the odds-on choice, but I wasn't blown away from a visual standpoint by her victory here, and I just need to see a little bit more from these Arkansas-based 3-year-old fillies before I back them against tougher company.
Yeah, I was all the fillies looked to be taking jumps in here, but several of them were coming out of the Honeybee, which was a race that I think was held back by a pretty slow pace that day. It was won by Will Secret, who went to Keeneland and didn't run particularly well. So that's no big surprise. I mean, it was a fairly easy speed figure to make, so I'm not going to knock it too much, but I would tend to agree these aren't the best fillies that we've seen. It was a small field. Only a couple of them really did much running at all. So, maybe at a huge price, I would like Pauline's Pearl, but I doubt that's going to happen being out of the Steve Asmussen barn. So, at a probably middling kind of 6 to 8 to 1, I'm not sure I'd be interested in her in the Oaks.
Yeah, and as we wrap up the discussion of the Kentucky Oaks, I mean, I think it's just coming up as a pretty competitive race because we've got a lot of these 3-year-old fillies that have pretty stellar records. Many of them have rarely been beaten. I think 3 of the horses we talked about that won these prep races are undefeated. So they're all going to get tested for class in that race. And I just think it's shaping up to be a really competitive affair. So I'm looking forward to that as a handicapping and wagering race.
Yeah, for sure. And it's one time where I think the pace projector is going to be pretty important to see how it shakes out because it could really shape who I would like in here personally. I know there's some horses with some speed, some others that like to come from off the pace, but it's hard to get a real picture on just how much until you see the actual horses and the post draw. But I think it's going to be a fascinating race, and some really solid fillies showed up. I was glad the preps, as you mentioned early in the show, took a kind of a jump forward this time. They're starting to get back to what we saw as 2-year-olds because it had been ugly up to this point, but some definite promising performances this Saturday.
Well, outside of those 3-year-old stakes races, there was plenty of other stakes action around the country this weekend, so we're going to go through it track by track. Let's start at Keeneland, where they had their opening week last weekend. Many stakes on their Friday and Saturday cards. One of the Grade 1 races that we didn't yet talk about from Saturday was the Grade 1 Madison for the older fillies and mares going 7 furlongs, and that was won by the Wesley Ward filly Kimari, who he's tried on a variety of surfaces throughout her career, but she keeps her undefeated record on dirt intact as she was able to win this race, holding off Bell's the One and a long shot Estilo Talentoso.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly want to see Kimari stick on dirt. She's undefeated. She certainly runs just fine on turf, and I don't know what the plans are for her, but she just doesn't lose on dirt, and she has a good running style. She's able to stay up close. She can come from behind. She's adapted to fast paces and slow paces, so I think she's very good, obviously. I mean, she only got a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, which seems to be what she generally runs when she's on this dirt surface. But I want to see her really get challenged and face some top sprinters and see what she can do, because my guess is she has a little more in the tank than we've been seeing.
And she has that versatility that allows her to overcome different kinds of pace scenarios, because we talked about the pace projector last week and how maybe it wasn't capturing her that accurately because it had her behind Bell's the One early, and that was based on some turf races where she had come from off the pace and a dirt race that featured a slow pace. But she does have plenty of tactical speed, and she showed that here by putting herself right off Bunday Call. And once that horse didn't really show up and faded in the stretch, I mean, she was right there to take over and sprint for the wire. I mean, Bell's the One was perhaps a little bit compromised by the moderate early pace, but she got there at the end and just couldn't really get close to Kimari. I think Kimari was the best horse, and as you said, I'll be interested to see what they decide to do with her in the future, because I agree. I think she's probably a little bit better on the dirt than she is on the turf. I know Wesley Ward loves to try those races over at Royal Ascot, but there are plenty of big races in the United States that she could run in, so I'd like to see her stick on dirt this year.
Yeah, and I like that she proved 7 furlongs is fine too, because she hadn't been that far as well that I remember, maybe on turf, but I don't think so. I think she had been kept to shorter distances up to this point, and she handled it just fine. And there's nothing I'd like more than to see her match up with a horse like Gamine that we're going to talk about later in the show.
Another race on Saturday at Keeneland at that same 7 furlong distance was the Grade 3 Commonwealth for the older males, and this one didn't go quite as fast as Kamari's final time, as Flagstaff got the job done here as the favorite. And Craig, usually when Flagstaff wins one of these races, the speed figure is not expected to come back that fast, and that was certainly the case here. It was just a race where nobody else really showed up with a breakout performance, and that allowed this horse to get the job done under who else? Joel Rosario.
Yeah, it was another where I got run down by Joel, 10-1, but he was the best horse. I have no complaints there. He even had a bit of a rough trip. Joel had to kind of work out some room, but once he did, he was clear. But I'll be honest, when I made these speed figures, I kind of had to do a double take, and then I went back and checked it again because it's just a really low speed figure for horses of this supposed quality. He only got a 111. Maybe part of that was the trip. It probably, easily could have hindered him 4 or 5 points. But anyway you look at it, this was a pretty weak race for Grade 3 older males. So I'm not going to get too excited about it. Hidden Scroll actually wound up the second choice. He bled in the race, so he was never a factor. Special Reserve had things his own way up front and just couldn't hang on. So I just don't think much of this race at all. And I'd be looking forward to betting against any and all of them if they show up on Derby Day in that Churchill Downs Stakes.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I have no problem with the speed figure. I mean, when you look through the rest of the field after Flagstaff, the number kind of makes perfect sense for them. It just wasn't that strong of a field coming in, and once horses like Hog Creek Hustle and Hidden Scroll didn't really show up, I mean, it just left it as a rare, relatively weak Grade 3 event, and Flagstaff is not the kind of horse that's ever going to win off by 5 lengths. I mean, he just got the job done here. So I kind of agree with you. Even when he's at his best, Flagstaff is rarely breaking 120, and we need to see a little bit more from the top sprinters in this country. So I'd be a little bit against him coming out of this race as well. Moving on to another sprint on that Saturday card at Keeneland, but this one was on the turf. That's the Grade 2 Shakertown, going 5.5 furlongs, and a perennial presence in this Shakertown is Bound for Nowhere. I think this was his 4th appearance in this race, and he won it for the 2nd time, and just a real admirable career that Wesley Ward has gotten out of this 7-year-old. He doesn't run that often, many layoffs peppering his running lines, but when he does run, he usually shows up, and he came with one of his good efforts here to run down Imprimis.
Yeah, this was impressive. As you said, it was his 4th time. He had 1 win. He had 2 losses by a neck, one of them to Imprimis a couple of years ago. But when he shows up, he just always runs the same race. He got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure for his win here. And what was most impressive to me is how he did it. He's a horse who's always been up or either on or very close to the early lead. And he showed he was able to raid off of it from the far outside. I'm sure I didn't watch the trip too close, but I'm sure he must have lost some ground out there. And he still came flying at the end. So just a huge effort from him. Who knows when we'll see him again, but when he does, I'm sure he'll be a threat.
Yeah, I saw some chatter after the race that people were saying Imprimis should have won this race, that he was clearly best just because he broke through the starting gate prior to them all breaking from the gate at the start of the race. And I don't know if that really mattered. I mean, I will say horses breaking through the gate before the start, it matters when it matters in the results. I mean, usually horses that fall apart after something like that, they run extremely poorly and they're no factor. But some horses, if they're not too rattled by it, they run just fine. And I think Imprimis was a horse that just wasn't too rattled by it. So, I mean, he put in a good effort, but I just thought Bound for Nowhere was better. He actually broke slower than Imprimis. That's why he was so far back early, because like you were saying, he's a horse that's typically placed much closer to the pace. But Joel Rosario just has that knack for getting horses to settle wherever he wants them to settle, and that was the case for Bound for Nowhere. He was a few lengths off the pace, but he came with that strong closing kick, something that we haven't always seen out of him, and he just ran that horse down Imprimis fair and square.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I even commented as much on Twitter. I'm sure breaking through the gate it's never a good thing, but given the trip Imprimis had and the way he ran, it's hard for me to think it had much of an effect, because Even if it did, I think it was counteracted by the fact he had an absolutely perfect trip and he was still run down. So he ran just fine. He just got beat by a better horse, in my opinion.
Final race from Saturday that we'll talk about at Keeneland was the Grade 2 Appalachian for the 3-year-old fillies. And this is one that I think was really decided by pace, as there just was not a whole lot of movement going on. Just a merry-go-round race all the way around the track. And Jouster, who was bet down to favoritism, she got to the front, set her own fractions, just was able to sprint to the wire.
Yeah, this race was pretty much over at the beginning. I forget which horse it was, but one of the horses had kind of a tough start that was expected to maybe be able to challenge Jouster early and wasn't able to do so. So we've talked about Jouster several times. She got beat last time, but ran just fine. But she seems to be a pretty consistent type. She got a 113 TimeformUS speed figure for this win. But I would keep an eye on Giftless, the runner-up, because given that pace, she didn't have much of a chance in her first start here in North America. And I guess you could say the same for Plum Ali as well. They both ran just fine. It was just a race that was 100% largely impacted by the pace, I should say. I mean, obviously, Jouster has to be good enough to take advantage, and she is, but it was just, the pace was really slow. She had everything go her way, so I think the other two ran well also.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the thing about Jouster is I'm not really sure where she's supposed to go from here, because I think she does not want to run a step past a mile. I mean, she got it here with a very slow pace, but we've seen in some prior starts that in these mile and 16th races that she tries, I mean, she's just gasping at the end, and I'd like to see her turn back to some sprint races. I think 6 or 7 furlongs at Belmont Park might be perfect for her because she has so much early speed. She just doesn't always have that staying power after she makes that kick for home. So I wonder what they'll decide to do with her, and I agree that you might want some of the horses that were running late in this race. I mean, Giftless ran fine, but I thought the horse that really ran well in this race was Plum Ali. I mean, she was farther back early and was flying in the stretch. I mean, she only lost this race by 2 lengths, and she was 5 lengths down at the stretch call, so she was really even cutting into Giftless at the end and was about to run by her as they came across the wire. I'm a little surprised that Plum Ali didn't get a bigger pace bonus in our TimeformUS PPs, but I thought that she was the one that really ran the best race in here, getting some adversity from a pace standpoint. So I'd look for her in the future, just especially given how well she ran as a 2-year-old. I think she's one that could take a step forward as a 3-year-old.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the speed figures. We do reward horses, as you mentioned, for closing fast in the slow pace races, but this is one where the pace was so slow, we even used that P designation and gave a little extra bonus to the horses because it just was impossible to rate with the other turf races on the card. So if you look in our running lines, you'll see only a 101 final time figure for Jouster, but a 113. So it was a pretty generous bump up, but I think it was warranted. I think it's a pretty good group, and the results would definitely be different with some more speed in here.
We also had some stakes action on Friday at Keeneland. Let's begin with the Transylvania, which is the male counterpart to the Appalachian that was run on Saturday. And the 3-year-old males here, perhaps not quite as impressive as the 3-year-old fillies, as Scarlet Sky got the job done with an eye-catching late run from last to first coming down the center of the track for Joel Rosario, of course. But I'm just not sure that I think a whole lot of the field that he was beating here.
Yeah, he only got a 107 TimeformUS speed figure. I don't want to knock the winner too much because the pace was pretty slow early. The first 2 fractions are coded in blue, but it did pick up noticeably in the middle sections. That's where I probably cost fire at will late, but really given that early pace, he didn't have much excuse. He maybe was just one of those horses that matured more than the crop earlier, and that's what enabled him to win the Breeders' Cup. But he hasn't looked very good to me. Obviously, they tried him on dirt first time out, and that didn't turn out very well. But this was a disappointing effort. That was my biggest takeout of the race, more so than the winner.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Even though it was a race that featured a slow pace early, it was still dominated by the 2 horses that were last and second to last going around the first turn. So it kind of fell apart in spite of the pace. And I agree with you. Fire at Will really had no excuse in this race. And he arguably would have been off the board if Barrister Tom, who was 4th, had gotten a clear run of the stretch. He was kind of bumped around and had to alter course down on the inside a little bit. So he was lucky to hold on for 3rd here. And Scarlet Sky, he's a nice horse. He was kind coming off a narrow loss to that undefeated runner Annex for Bill Mott, who we've seen at Gulfstream win a couple of stakes races. But not these 3-year-old males. They're just not running speed figures that are all that impressive. So we'll have to see if they can step forward in the coming months. That pretty fast race for the 3-year-old fillies that you had mentioned earlier in the podcast was the Grade 3 Beaumont, which was run over that about 7 furlong distance on the dirt at Keeneland on Friday. And 20 Carat for Wesley Ward. She kept her undefeated record intact. She was making her first start on dirt, though, after a couple performances over the Tapeta at Turfway Park, and certainly seems like dirt might be her preferred surface because she took a big step forward here.
Yeah, no shock for an Into Mischief, I guess. Although they seem to be able to run on anything. They're particularly good on the dirt. And yeah, it's a nice jump up. She got a 1:16 TimeformUS speed figure, beating Slumber Party, who I believe we had talked about her maiden win on the Pacecast when she won back in January, and she ran just fine as well with a 1:13. This was a race, it almost looked too fast to be true, but I timed it, given it's at that odd distance at Churchill at about 7 furlongs. It's really 7 point, I think it's 2.7 furlongs or so. So that's something Keeneland does publish somewhere, and you can find out what that about exactly is. But it turned out it was just a pretty fast race for 3-year-old fillies. So it does award Oaks points. I doubt any of these horses would be pointed to the Kentucky Oaks. They probably didn't even qualify, I wouldn't think, because it certainly wasn't a 100 points race. But if they did, I still think these are mostly sprinter types, and I wouldn't be looking for them as Oaks contenders.
Yeah, I had wondered if you considered breaking this race out because it was the only race that was run at that unusual about 7 furlong distance. And it's a number that I guess makes a little bit of sense for the runner-up Slumber Party, but the others, I think it's hard to buy that like 3 horses in this race all improved their figures by 20 points, at least for me, even though they're lightly raced 3-year-olds. So I'm not sure what to make of it. I mean, 20 Carat, she looked nice in victory, and she's got a pedigree that suggests more distance might actually be to her benefit, even though she's by Into Mischief. She's got a real stamina-laden female family. She's actually a full sister to that horse Mystic Knight that's in Chad Brown's stable, who we talked about winning a very fast 1 1/8 race at Aqueduct a few weeks ago. So, I mean, she's bred to go longer. I just wonder if this race is really as strong as the speed figure suggests. I know that it looks fast, and I trust that your video timing on this one. I was just a little surprised to see this race come back that fast after watching it.
Yeah, I do have similar reservations. It's certainly one I'm going to keep an eye on, but it's one of those where I lean on the fact that I know these races usually line up pretty well with the other sprint distances. Because we do know the exact distance. So it's still, there are times where it's an outlier. I mean, it's run on a part of the course that's not used any other time but for these races. So it will be one to keep an eye on. There were 2 4.5 furlong 2-year-old baby races on the card, which obviously can't use much of those as far as making speed figures. But given the other races, it seems solid, but I agree. I'm a little bit skeptical, and we'll certainly keep an eye on the runbacks from this one.
Let's move on to the final stakes race that we're going to talk about from Keeneland last week. That was the Palisades Turf Sprint. It was the first stakes race they ran on that Friday card, and the Joel Rosario show really started here as he guided Chasing Artie to victory for Wesley Ward from off the pace. And in typical Joel fashion, he took a horse that was a speed demon on the lead in his prior starts, took him back to last after a slow start, and was able to ride him like he was a deep closer.
Yeah, this is a race, unless you had complete faith in Joel Rosario, you'd probably be a little leery because the pace projector said it was going to be a fast pace. I do think it turned out to be a fast pace with all the fractions coded in red, but Joel just made the right decision, kind of like he did on Bound for Nowhere. He took the horse back off the pace. He apparently knew he could do something that wasn't in the PPs, and it worked out great. He was able to make that late rally, ran a 1:06 TimeformUS speed figure, beat his stablemate Fauci, who was much closer, so I thought he ran just fine as well with a 1:05, but no shock, Wesley Ward with a couple good turf sprinters in here.
Wraps up the action from Keeneland, and let's move on to the Santa Anita Stakes action from this past weekend. We'll begin with a few races from their Saturday card on the turf. One of those was the Grade 2 Royal Heron for the older fillies and mares going a mile, and Charmaine's Mia kept her winning streak intact since coming into Phil D'Amato's barn in Southern California, and she's just been so good since making this trainer switch, and she set a pretty honest pace here going a mile and still was able to hold on late in a race where those that were chasing her faded pretty badly in the stretch.
Yeah, she's just gotten really good. As you say, that's now 3 for 3, once at 6 furlongs, twice at a mile. She usually runs around that 120th speed figure in the new barn. She got a 122 for this race, so another big effort from her, and she's clearly the best in the division out there right now. She was 3 to 5 for a reason. Dog Tag was kind of a pleasant surprise. He had shipped in, was in a new barn in the Richard Mandela barn. I don't know if she was or not before, but I hadn't seen her in a while. I know at one point she was in the Chad Brown barn. I guess she's been in California for a while, but this was the best race she's ever run as well, with a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. So I thought both those two ran pretty well, but Charmaine's Mia is just really, really good right now.
Another impressive performance came out of a 3-year-old filly in the Grade 3 Providencia, also on that Saturday card, and going global. She got the job done here, also winning her third race in this country. She stretched out to the 9 furlongs. I'm not sure that 9 furlongs is necessarily a natural fit for this horse, but she was just better than her competition here.
Yeah, she was. I wound up being a replay of her last race where Closing Remarks gave her a tough run to the wire. And same thing here. She got a 110, overcoming a pretty slow pace up front. We have all the fractions coated in blue, but she was able to wear down Closing Remarks. I do think it was a really good ride again by Flavien Prat. He was able to get the jump on his rival while she was a bit bottled up inside. And when you have a slow pace like this, it's kind of good to get revved up a little early, and I think that made the difference. I mean, she may have been as good as or better than the winner anyway, but the ride certainly helped.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to watch this race because she's a very small filly. I mean, you could see it coming down the stretch. The runner-up kind of towered over her, even though that she was coming up the inside, which is why I say that maybe a mile and an eighth is a little bit far for her, because typically these smaller statured runners, they want to go a little bit shorter. But she showed a lot of gameness to battle onto the wire and beat that horse, and it was a fast race, so she's definitely in the conversation as among the best 3-year-old filly turf horses out there, even though she's running in California, which is typically a division that's a little weaker than what we see on the East Coast. Moving on with the Southern California Stakes action, we saw the return of one of the best horses racing right now. That is Gamine, the winner of last year's Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint for Bob Baffert. She made her 4-year-old debut in the Los Flores on Sunday, and just 3 rivals signed on to face her. Never was supposed to be a competitive race, and it didn't turn out to be, as Gamine really won like it was just a morning workout.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the official speed figure for this will be, and I'm not even sure it'll have any meaning whatsoever because this was a paid workout. The pace was super slow. Gamine absolutely flew home. My guess is it's going to get around a 113 speed figure. The final time will be 116. A little bit pace adjusted, but it's just one of those, she's so much better than all the others. I'm basically making the speed figure on the other 3 so I don't overrate them and putting her above them. I say me, it's my assistant doing it, but we basically do things the same way. I talked about Malathot earlier having a last incremental fraction of 136 or so in the Ashland. Well, Gamine's in here will be about a 160, which is almost unheard of for a sprinter. It's just something you don't see, particularly for a horse on the front end. So to my eye, she came back as good or better than ever. She ran a 133 when she won the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint last year, and she looks like the same exact horse or even better to me this year. So it would be pretty scary. I mentioned I'd like to see her match up against Kamari. That doesn't mean I think Kamari could beat her, because I don't. I just think it would get the best out of her to chase a filly of this quality. And she just looks like it's like much the best of the division, despite what'll probably be a lower speed figure here.
Yeah, and Gamine is a horse that I know is a little bit triggering for some people because of the medication positive issue from last year. But I mean, we have to talk about the actual performances and getting past all that a little bit. And I mean, she's just an incredibly talented horse. I mean, she runs the kinds of races that you rarely see from fillies and mares. The way that she finishes off these sprints, it's just so impressive. She can get a mile, and I think that makes her so dangerous going the 7 furlongs, which she will stretch out next time out in the Derby City Distaff. And I completely agree with you. I'll be interested to see how Kamari does in a top-level dirt race, but based on what we saw from Gamim this past weekend, I don't think she has much of a prayer of beating her in her current form. Bob Baffert had another impressive winner, or 2 more impressive winners, I should say, over the weekend that we'll talk about. Not in stakes company. One of those was in a maiden race on Saturday as he sent out the Juddmonde-owned Laurel River to get the job done. This was a horse that made just 1 start last year. That was a little bit disappointing, but he came back off the layoff here and looked pretty good. He had been trading well into this race, I believe, in company with Medina Spirit, and he ran to those strong works to get the job done over a heavily bet stablemate that just didn't really show up.
Yeah, I was a little confused by that one because, I mean, Laurel River was a horse who took a lot of money first time out, went off 6-5, didn't run particularly great with a bit of a tough trip at 5.5 furlongs, but as you said, he'd been working out great. And so I wasn't really surprised. I didn't do the speed figure, but it was one when it came back at 115. It didn't shock me at all. I thought this was a really fast race. There were plenty other sprints on the card, including a couple Calbred Stakes races. So I don't think there was anything fluky about this effort at all. The 2, 3, 4 finishers even got really nice speed figures in the 107 all the way up to 109 range. So I think this is going to prove to be a pretty strong maiden race, and we'll see a lot of winners come out of it.
Yeah, I agree with you. This horse won the right way. I mean, he finished up pretty strongly, even after contesting an honest pace up front, and he's bred to go longer distances. I mean, these Juddmonde-bred runners often are, even though he's by into mischief. His dam is a full sister to Emollient, who was a horse that did very well for Juddmonde from Bill Mott on the turf a few years ago. I think she ran a little bit on the dirt, but I think she was a Grade 1 winner going 1.25 miles on the turf, so definitely a lot to look forward to with this horse, as long as he can stay on the racetrack. And that other Bob Baffert runner that I mentioned as we wrap up the action from Santa Anita was Crystal Ball, a 4-year-old filly who won a Friday allowance race. She was making her first start since finishing off the board in the Alabama last summer at Saratoga. But prior to that, she was a pretty game second to Paris Lights, who we'll also talk about on this podcast a little bit later in the Coaching Club American Oaks back in July of last year. And she made her return off the long layoff here, and I thought did what she had to do to win this race, but I'm not sure that this performance really puts her in the conversation among the best older fillies or mares in the country.
No, for sure. I wouldn't say that either, but I think it was a promising sign that she ran a career best TimeformUS speed figure, even if it was just by a couple points with a 114, but that's what you want to see from a newly turned 4-year-old. I doubt she was fully cranked up, and maybe there's some more in the tank, but as you say, she'd still have to find several more lengths to get up to the top fillies, but there's time for that, and I was impressed by what I saw.
Okay, we'll move on to our final venue that we'll talk about on this podcast, and that is the Aqueduct Stakes action from last week that was run on the Wood Memorial undercard, as well as another stakes from last Friday. Let's begin with the one Grade 1 race that they ran last weekend at Aqueduct. That was the Carter, going 7 furlongs, and Safi Joseph, since he's gotten Mischievous Alex into his barn, he's delivered nothing but wins from this horse, and he continued that here in the Carter as he won off impressively by over 5 lengths. Probably not beating a field that you would say is quite up to snuff as Grade 1 quality, but still, this horse was visually impressive in victory.
Yeah, he looked good, and this was a race that was a little tough as a speed figure guy because it came up so much faster than the other sprints on the card. But when I sat down to do the figures, for me, it was clear I couldn't rate this race with the other ones. It would just make all the horses in the field run way too fast, in my opinion. So if people are wondering, I think Bayer gave a 109 or a 110, why we have it so much lower. We just went different directions in this one. He rated the races together and I didn't. And even knowing that decision, looking back at it, I would make the same decision 10 times out of 10. It's certainly one that I would monitor going forward. But had I not done that, the 2, 3, 4 finishers all would have ran way faster than I would have expected given what I saw on the track. So I'm going to stick with the 119 that I gave Mischievous Alex in here. And, I mean, it's a good enough figure, but it fits what we've seen from him, and it kind of lines up with all the other horses as well. So curious what you think about that. I'm sure you noticed that I didn't rate it the same as the other one, and I imagine I'll get some flack from that from the Twitter police.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of at a point where I'm not going to make a big stink about these Aqueduct figures because they're just so difficult, and the speed of the track it changes throughout the day. It changes from day to day, and it's just hard to know if it's consistent enough to rely on it to make as big a speed figure as Mischievous Alex would have gotten in this race if you had grouped them all together. It kind of reminds me of that situation when Come Dancing won the Distaff Handicap a couple years ago, and I think got a number in the mid 130s, which was I was in favor of giving her the big number at the time, and I kind of acknowledged, as I think you did, that it was a number that probably was unlikely to be repeated by the winner or the horses that finished directly behind her, because Aqueduct just does tend to produce those outlier final times, especially when the pace is a little bit different from the other races of the day, and that was certainly the case in this Carter. It was a race that just featured a much faster pace than we saw really in any of the other sprint races on this card, and I think that led to the faster final time. So it's one where I really wouldn't have had a problem either way. I think that the 119 that you gave Mischievous Alex is more in line with what I expect to see from this horse in the future. But if you had given him a number in, I guess, the low 130s, which is what he would have gotten if you had grouped them all together, I wouldn't have had a problem with that either, because I think you kind of understand that these Aqueduct figures, horses are not always going to run back to them.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing is, like I said, the second and third finishers would have got figures in the mid 120s. Chateau would have gotten a figure that would have been even better than his win last time out. And personally, I just couldn't buy that. I mean, it's possible I'll be wrong. I mean, I've been wrong before, but I just wanted to rate these horses with how I think they really ran. And the pace plays a part in that as well. The fact that basically what I'm saying is for this race, the track sped up. The track maintenance guy did something different, or maybe there was a big wind on the backstretch, stronger than the rest of the day. But whatever it was, it caused all the fractions to be quick as well. So that kind of goes into my thinking also.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that. I really think it was a pace thing. I mean, they went, I think, 2 full seconds faster to the half mile than the Bayshore, which we're going to talk about next. And in sprint races over a pretty dead surface, that is a major impact on the final time, because it's not like we're seeing horses coming home in like 12 flat for the final eighth at Aqueduct. That's just never happening. So, I mean, I think if you start out fast, you have a much better chance of running a faster final time. And I mean, I would say that the number for the Carter that makes sense is probably somewhere in the mid to low 120s. But contrary to popular belief, it's not like Craig can just say, okay, I watch this race and I think, okay, 124 makes sense. I mean, that's not how speed figure making works. You have to either group it with the other races or group it without the other races. So, I mean, that's just how the numbers work out. But from a handicapping standpoint, I think you probably got this one right moving forward.
Yeah, and just real quick, you mentioned the pace being so much faster. The thing is, with the race earlier on the card that we're going to talk about, is it's not like it was a slow pace for that final time. That race actually basically fell apart. It came up with a much slower time compared to the the opening quarter mile. So it was really a tricky day, and certainly one that I will monitor going forward.
And speaking of that Bayshore, it was won by another Saffie Joseph trained runner in Drain the Clock, who got a 110 figure in winning this race, 9 points lower than the Carter. And that's the one Craig was referencing, is I think Beyer had a big discrepancy between these two races, something along the lines of 25 points. And that's just the difference that's going to happen when you group those races together, given the difference in final time was, I think, over exactly 2 seconds between these races. Drain the Clock ran fine to win this race. He was obviously geared down at the end. I think that the margin, though, would have been a little bit narrower if the runner-up, Whiskey Double, had a clear run through the final quarter mile.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I even have Drain the Clock dropping 5 points off his last speed figure, improving a little bit off his prior sprint. All the other horses look okay, so I'm pretty comfortable with the rating of this race. I gave Drain the Clock a 110. The runner-up got a 107, and as you said, I think he easily could have run a better race with a cleaner trip for Jose Ortiz. But as we saw most of the weekend, Irad won a majority of the races, and Jose was right there when he didn't.
Yeah, it wasn't quite as dominant as the show that Joel Rosario put on at Keeneland, but Irad Ortiz was winning a lot of races this past abbreviated week at Aqueduct, and he rode drain the clock with a ton of confidence in this one. Another graded stakes race from Saturday at Aqueduct was the Excelsior, going 1.125 miles, the same distance as the Wood Memorial and the Gazelle, though this is one where the final time was definitely impacted by the pace, because once Mr. Buff scratched out of this race, there was just no speed left, and they really crawled on the front end.
Yeah, it's when I think it was a 52 fraction popped up or something. It's probably happened before, but it's certainly nothing I can remember in a graded stakes for older males, partly because of the track, but mostly because there was just no pace on. This is one where our final time figure is only a 105, but Modernist got a 115 TimeformUS speed figure. And it's a case where the entire field, in my opinion, was impacted by the slow pace, not just the winner. I kind of talked about this a little bit on Twitter. You want to rate these horses with what you think they can run in these spots. And what I do is look for when the race impacts the vast majority of the field, not just 1 or 2 or maybe even 50%. And I think that was definitely the case in this spot where it was just such a ridiculous pace that I don't want to rate this race and give it a TimeformUS overall speed figure of 105. And then when these horses run back, it impacts things like the pace projector and our power picks and our check marks and things like that. So those are things we take into consideration. And I mean, if Modernist run back, I would fully expect them to run a 115 or better and under more normal circumstances. I thought High Cal ran actually really well. It was good to see him get back in the form. He was a one horse that was actually closing ground late and making a dent.
Yeah, I agree. Haikal really came up with this performance out of nowhere because he had been in terrible form for Todd Pletcher since coming back off a layoff. But he rebounded here with a good effort. The bettors apparently knew it because they bet him down to 5-2, even in this paceless race. And he made a good late run at Modernist, but I just don't think Haikal, even on his best day, wants to go 1.125 miles. And Modernist was able to kick away from him at the end. I mean, we'll see what we get from Modernist down the line. He's going to have to run a lot better to win any graded stakes in the future. But he clearly has taken a step forward as a 4-year-old for Bill Mott. So he could have a brighter future than this. We saw another victory from a Bill Mott-trained runner on Friday in the Distaff Handicap. Paris Lights, who had beaten Crystal Ball, we just talked about at Santa Anita in that close photo in the Coaching Club American Oaks last summer. She made her first start since then, cutting back to 7 furlongs in this Distaff, and got the job done in a pretty hard-fought victory in yet another race where I think you probably had to struggle with this speed figure a little bit because it just didn't make a whole lot of sense in the context of the day.
No, this one was nuts. And fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, it's something I've seen occur pretty regularly at Aqueduct, where the 7 furlong races just make absolutely no sense compared to the others. It wasn't a case where it was a slow pace that made it look so slow. It was just clearly something happened to the track. I mean, I timed it. The time was fine on video, but something about this race made it come up incredibly slow. And if I rated it with all the other races, I would be basically saying these are about $15,000 claiming horses. And we know that's not the case. So this race got that B notation for breakout because it was just a race where I used a different variant from all the other dirt races that day, which were all at one turn, by the way. So it's one... Even though it has that breakout, I mean, I'm pretty confident it's an accurate reflection of the race because every horse in the field, it was really consistent projections. And Paris Light's got a 115 for me. I thought she ran just fine in here. A pretty wild turn back in distance from what we'd seen from her last summer, but a good effort that suggests she could be moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I thought Paris Lights ran fine. I think she's ultimately going to want to go longer distances in the future. This 7 furlong race was just a starting point, and Bill Mott acknowledged that coming into the race. But she was gritty to win, and I thought it was a good performance from her. But I think this is just another example, Craig, where I really want to commend you for getting on top of what's happening at Aqueduct this winter and trying to make these speed figures as useful as possible to the public, because I know you understand that speed figures are first and foremost a handicapping tool, and you want the speed figures to be something that the handicappers can rely on moving forward. And, I've seen a lot of other numbers for Aqueduct just kind of go with the times and not make the case that the track is changing that much, and that you get some really wacky numbers and some figures that just are not going to be run back to by these horses. And I know that you've kind of gone out on a limb a little bit by breaking more of these races out or having the track changing a lot during the day. But I mean, for me, as someone who's handicapping the races at Aqueduct and using the figures a lot, I think it's made me rely a lot more on the TimeformUS speed figures because I know the kind of work you're putting into them. So I just want to say I appreciate it. I think this is just another example of you giving the horses the figure that they really deserve.
Yeah, I mean, it comes with experience. I've done this a long time, and I pretty much have an idea when I'm about to make a ridiculous speed figure that the horses are never going to run back to. I much prefer to go with the clock, as I'm sure most speed figure makers do, but there are times you just can't because it doesn't make sense. I'm not a track super. I don't know what they're doing. They don't tell us what's happening, but usually the numbers don't lie. So I use a lot of statistical analysis in these things and just go with the one that is most likely. If the clock says one thing, but there's an 80% chance it's going to be wrong, then I'm not going to use the clock.
Yeah, and on that Friday card at Aqueduct, I mean, there was a race a couple before the distaff that was won by an undefeated filly from Parks named Chubwagon going 6 furlongs, and if you had grouped those two races together, she would have got a number that's 10 to 15 points higher than Paris Lights, which just does not make a lot of sense. So I think you handled it the right way, and I think these are numbers that you can kind of rely on moving forward. One more race that I wanted to mention from Aqueduct last week, and it was the only turf race that we'll talk about from Aqueduct as they began turf racing this past Friday. And this was a race from Saturday going a mile and a 16th on the turf. Flighty Lady, who was making her first start in this country for Peter Brandt and Chad Brown, got the job done. She had some good form over in France. She was multiple group placed in that country. I think group 1 placed as a 2-year-old. And I just thought this was a pretty visually impressive U.S. debut.
Yeah, I will admit these are pretty tough figures to make because, they're only running one turf race a day. At least they did on the Saturday card, one on the inner turf, one on the outer turf. In this case, we had some foreign shippers coming over, so kind of relying on the Timeform ratings that we get for them. But I don't think there's much doubt this was a pretty good effort, not surprising for a Chad Brown shipper. Flighty Lady got a 115 for the win, as did the runner-up. It's one that I will keep an eye on, but given the connections, it wouldn't surprise me at all if this is a stake source.
Yeah, and Chad Brown, he typically gets some of these runners from Europe when they're 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and turns them into graded stakes winners, and I would not be shocked if Flighty Lady turned out to be one of those types of runners, just given the impressive nature of her U.S. debut here. But I'm sure we'll see many other powerful performances from the Chad Brown barn in the coming weeks on the turf in New York. Well, that's all the racing to recap on this podcast. There was quite a bit of it. This one's a little bit longer than usual, but we wanted to get all of these in and give each of these top horses a mention that competed in graded stakes this past week. And just a lot to look forward to on the horse racing landscape as we march on towards those races at Churchill Downs, the Kentucky Derby and the Kentucky Oaks. I think we got a lot of clarity in those two pictures, the 3-year-old fillies and the 3-year-old males, but there's more to look forward to this weekend with the Arkansas Derby coming up on Saturday, concert tour for Bob Baffert, likely to be a big favorite there. I'm sure we'll talk about that race and some others on the TimeformUS Pacecast this upcoming Friday, but just a real lot to look forward to in the 3-year-old division moving ahead in these upcoming few weeks.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it. I think we pretty much have the final chapter this weekend before the Oaks and Derby, always an exciting time of year, and then hopefully a couple slower weeks because I'm going to need it after this Pacecast.
I'm on the same page as you on that. Remember that you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and make sure to tune into that TimeformUS forecast on Friday.